So the Israelis go to the Americans and they say, listen, we prefer Russia to be next door instead of Turkey because Turkey is one of our enemies. Turkey is a major enemy. It's our biggest enemy. And the Americans tell the Israelis, no, Turkey is a NATO member. Don't you want a NATO member to be next door? Why would you want some Iranian ally, Russia, to be next door? Why would you want that? Don't you want an ally of the United States? No. We don't want that ally. We really don't. Isn't it amazing that the Israelis are now asking for another Iranian ally to stay in Syria? I thought Israel was an ally of NATO. They're friends with NATO. They're friends with America. Why doesn't Israel want a fellow NATO ally to be next door? Assad kept the frontier with the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights quiet for years, despite his alliance with Israel's arch-foe Iran. So the eye doctor really wasn't that bad. So, here we go. This is by far the craziest thing that I have read in the news. So it says here that Israel lobbies U.S. to keep Russian bases in a weak Syria to prevent Hamas stronghold. So Israel is telling the Americans, guys, can you not push the Russians out of Syria? Israel's telling the U.S. this. It's surreal. For how long were the Israelis telling the Americans, the Iranians, they're the worst thing ever. They are the number one threat to Israel. They're the number one threat to world peace. They're the worst thing ever. And then Israel pulls a stunt where it starts supporting the rebels in Syria to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. And then Bashar al-Assad gets overthrown. And guess what? The Israelis were supporting Jabhat al-Nusra. I've talked about this many, many times. But the Israelis were indeed supporting Jabhat al-Nusra. And now Jabhat al-Nusra is the most powerful faction in Syria, other than Turkey. But by faction, I'm talking rebel group. Out of all the rebel groups, Jabhat al-Nusra came out on top. So Jabhat al-Nusra changed its name, called itself HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And now they are, at face value, right, on paper, they are ruling Syria. They're running the government in Syria. It's really Turkey that's running everything. But as far as having a face of a government goes, HTS is running Syria. And this was the very rebel faction that Israel was backing for years. They were giving money to this group to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Because Bashar al-Assad was an ally of Iran. He was a satellite of Iran. His government was a satellite of Iran. And now Bashar is gone. He's over there, drinking vodka in Russia. And now Israel is worried about what? They're worried about what has replaced Bashar al-Assad. You'll say it's HTS. At face value, right, on paper, HTS is running things. They're the government. But in reality, Turkey is running everything. Turkey is running everything in Syria. And now you have Turkey right next door to Israel. It's not only does this country hate Israel, because Iran hates Israel. And Israel was very worried about Iran, still is worried about Iran, but now it has something even bigger to worry about, and that is the second most armed country in NATO, and not only does it hate Israel, it's now right next door to Israel. So it's like Israel just compounded its problems tenfold, 100-fold. So now you have two big countries in Syria, and they're rivaling, well, three countries, Israel, Russia, and Turkey. But the two biggest players in Syria really are Russia and Turkey. Israel is trying to control southern Syria. They're trying to purge the area of Islamist rebels, and they want to make sure that Turkey doesn't get too close. But then you have Russia. Russia is on the western coast of Syria. They're on the Tartus. They have a naval base on the coast of the Tartus. They also have the Himalayan air base. And Russia doesn't want to evacuate out of Syria. Russia doesn't want to withdraw out of Syria because Russia wants that direct access into the Mediterranean. And I believe also Russia wants to keep the Turks in check. There is a rivalry between the Turks and the Russians. although they do play this diplomatic game. And so Russia is historically Russia is the biggest enemy of Turkey. And so the biggest enemy of Turkey, the biggest historical enemy of Turkey, is in Syria, rivaling with Turkey. So Israel is very worried about Turkey attacking it from Syria. But you have the biggest enemy of Turkey also in Syria. So the Israelis are thinking, okay, well, we can use the Russians to help us keep the Turks in check. So the Americans, people in the Pentagon, they want Russia out of Syria. This is the plan. They want Russia out, get out of Syria. But the Israelis know, and everyone else knows, that if you push the Russians out of Syria, then the biggest powerhouse in Syria is going to be Turkey, which means Turkey would get even more powerful, and then you would have an even more powerful Turkey right next door to Israel, and Israel would be in even bigger trouble. So the Israelis are now begging the Americans to not push the Russians out of Syria, because Trump is bettering relations. As Machiavellian as Trump is, regardless of his Machiavellian motives, Trump is having a friendly, cordial connection with the Russians right now. And the Israelis know this. So the Israelis are telling the Trump administration, hey, since you're nice with the Russians, since you are being cordial and diplomatic with the Russians, tell them not to leave Syria and don't try to push them out of Syria, because that would spell more trouble for Israel. Because I've said this before, but Turkey eventually is going to have a war with Israel. And Turkey is a serious country. It has a very sophisticated military. It has a very sophisticated defense industry. And Israel doesn't want to have a war with the second most armed country in NATO. It would spell a disaster for Israel. It would be devastating for Israel. You would have very high casualties. It'll be bloody. And so the Israelis don't want that to happen, so they're begging the Americans to not push the Russians out. They don't want the Russians to be pushed out, because that would make Turkey even more powerful, and that would make that would create an even more powerful Turkey entrenched in Syria. So let's read this article here. This is from Haaretz. It came out today. It says, Israel's big fear is that Turkey comes in and protects this new Syrian Islamist order, which then ends up being a base for Hamas and other militants, said one expert. Now, this is what these Israeli experts are saying. This is not Israel's biggest fear. Israel's biggest fear is not a bunch of terrorists in pajamas being in Syria. That's not Israel's biggest fear. Israel knows that it can control and contain those rebel factions, just like it has been containing Hamas, just like Israel was able to work with Syria when it was under Bashar al-Assad. Israel knows that that's not an existential threat. Hamas is not an existential threat. Even Hezbollah is not an existential threat. Israel knows that the existential threat in Syria is Turkey. That's what it's worried about. It's not worried about rebels. This is all just a way to say, this is all just a way for Israel to say, we're not too worried about Turkey invading us, because Israel is hoping that maybe they can have some diplomatic relations being maintained between the two countries. So they're not going to say, oh, we're worried about being invaded. They're going to say, well, we're worried about Hamas. We're worried about rebels. We're worried about those people. They don't want to say, oh, we actually believe that we can be invaded. They don't want to say that, because I guess they don't want to show weakness, or they don't want to show that they are ready for a full-on war. They don't want to make it out that a war is right around the corner. So they're saying, well, we're worried about Hamas. And it's just a nice way of trying to keep diplomacy, or some semblance of diplomacy. Israel might have started watching your video. Maybe. But remember, I was talking about Turkey destroying Israel way before the Israeli government started talking about it. I was talking, well, not destroying Israel. The Israeli government is not talking about destroying Israel, but I was talking about Turkey doing a Holocaust of the Israelis. And now you have the Israeli government saying we're actually worried about a war with Turkey. But they're saying that their concern is Hamas. That's not their concern. Their concern is Turkey. That's it. If you have Hamas in Syria, Israel can take care of it. That's not a big deal. Just like they've taken care of Hamas in Gaza. It's not a big deal for Israel. It really isn't. They're worried about, as far as existential threats go, they are worried about a rising Turkey next door. But it says here that Israel is lobbying the United States to keep Syria weak and decentralized, including by letting Russia keep its military bases there to counter Turkey's growing influence in the country, four sources familiar with the efforts said. Turkey's often fraught ties with Israel have come under severe strain during the Gaza war, and Israeli officials have told Washington that Syria's new Islamist rulers, who are backed by Ankara, pose a threat to Israel's borders, the sources said. So this is, it's true, right, that these rebels who are backed by Turkey do pose some threat, but they are not an existential threat. And again, I know that the Israelis know this, because you have Israeli officials who have said these sorts of things. They have said, Bashar al-Assad is not a threat. They have said that Hamas is not an existential threat. Hezbollah is not an existential threat. But when it comes to existential threats, an actual threat that could destroy Israel, they're talking about Turkey. That's what they're talking about. That's what they're talking about. And we've been talking about this for years. We've been saying this on Shubat.com for years. My dad was saying it many, many years ago. People didn't believe him at first, but now you see the reality. And I am just amazed. I am just amazed at how much the Israelis keep screwing themselves over. How much the Israelis keep doing things that further lead to their demise. Let's just put it that way. You can see videos of Netanyahu back in the day, back in the early 2000s, ancient times, when nobody was talking about Turkey. You can see videos of Netanyahu back in those days saying what? We gotta remove Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is the big threat. There's a video, you can find it on X pretty easily. Netanyahu says, if you remove Saddam Hussein, I assure you that the situation in the Middle East will become will become so much better. There's a video you can see of Netanyahu saying this. I guarantee you that the situation in the Middle East will become so much better. The Middle East will become so much more stable if you remove Saddam Hussein. And literally the exact opposite happened. The exact opposite happened. It caused a whole ripple effect that led to massive destabilization in the Middle East. And all that destabilization in Iraq boiled over into Syria. And then what happened? The Israelis started talking about removing Bashar al-Assad. We got to remove him because he's part of this Shiite chain of terror. He's part of the axis of terror by the Shiites. And they removed Bashar. And now they're worried about what? Oh, Turkey. Now, but literally anyone who has read about the whole situation in the Middle East, how things work over there, could have told you that Turkey will rise if you remove Bashar al-Assad. Hell, we were writing this back when the Syrian revolution was a very new phenomenon. We were writing about this. There's an article that I wrote. You can find it from 2012, in which I said, removing Bashar al-Assad is only empowering the Turks. This war against Bashar al-Assad is about empowering the Turks. And the Turks were behind this revolution from the beginning because their whole goal has been taking over that country. So everyone knew this. Everyone knew this. The Israelis knew this. Why did they remove Bashar al-Assad? I don't know. Maybe they're under a demonic delusion. That's what I think. I think it's a satanic delusion. I've always believed your dad and you. Keep it up. Thank you, Marine veteran. The lobbying points to a concerted Israeli campaign to influence U.S. policy at a critical juncture for Syria, as the Islamists who ousted Bashar al-Assad try to stabilize the fractured state and get Washington to lift punishing sanctions. Israel communicated its views to top U.S. officials during meetings in Washington in February and subsequent meetings in Israel with U.S. congressional representatives, 3 U.S. sources and another person familiar with the contacts said. So again, we're not seeing how the United States has responded to this. We don't know exactly what the Americans are telling the Israelis as a response to their request to not push the Russians out of Syria, to keep the Russians in Syria. So we have yet to see what's going to happen. It's going to be very, very interesting to see. We are living in a very, very surreal time. But it's like every day you look at the news and you're thinking, okay, what craziness are we going to see? And it says here, the main points were also circulated to some senior U.S. officials in an Israeli white paper, two of the sources said. Now, I would love to see what this white paper says, because when you hear the term white paper, what you're hearing is that there is some sort of an official discussion happening, or there's some kind of official political happening that's occurring behind the curtains, but we don't know what the nature of this sort of discussion is, what the nature of this sort of discourse is. But it'll be very interesting to see what the Americans are telling the Israelis. Are the Americans telling the Israelis, don't worry, we're going to keep the Russians there? Are the Americans lying to the Israelis, saying, oh yeah, don't worry, we're not going to push them out, only to later on try to push the Russians out, only to later on empower Turkey to fight to push the Russians out? What exactly is going to happen? What I do know what's going to happen is there's going to be a clash between the Israelis and the Russians. That is what I do know is going to happen. I think eventually there's going to be a clash, and I think eventually Israel will be devastated in a massive war. That's what I believe. And there's going to be another Holocaust. Sad to say, but that's what I believe is going to happen. All the sources spoke on condition of anonymity due to diplomatic sensitivities. Israel's big fear is that Turkey comes in and protects this new Syrian Islamist order, which then ends up being a base for Hamas and other militants. Again, this is not Israel's biggest fear. It's a concern that they have, don't get me wrong, but there's no way that this is Israel's biggest fear. Israel is not worried about some Hamas militants across the border. It's not. They can deal with that. Israel is worried about a massive Turkish power being right next door, and then being further empowered by a Russian withdrawal from Syria. That is what Israel is worried about. They're worried about the second most armed country in NATO going to war with Israel. That's what they're worried about. That's it. It's very simple. Very, very simple. It was not clear to what extent U.S. President Donald Trump's administration is considering adopting Israel's proposals, the sources said. It has said little about Syria, leaving uncertainty over both the future of the sanctions and whether U.S. forces deployed in the Northeast will remain. That's another big concern. That's another big thing. Is America going to keep troops in Syria? There are around, I want to say, 2,000 or so American soldiers currently in Syria. Is Trump going to keep them there? Is Trump going to pull them out? If Trump pulls out the soldiers, that will further empower Turkey. That will enable Turkey, because Turkey will say, okay, the Americans have left a vacuum. We are now going to fill that vacuum up. And that would enable Turkey to be more empowered. Lund said Israel had a good chance of influencing U.S. thinking, describing the new administration as wildly pro-Israel. Syria is barely even on Trump's radar now. It's low priority, and there is a policy void to fill. So yeah, so it's possible that Trump will say, okay, let the Israelis and the Turks work together to fill in a vacuum. That's a possibility, because Turkey is a big ally of the United States. It's a major member of NATO. So it's possible that the Americans will tell the Turks, okay, you're going to join forces with the Israelis. That could happen. I do see some sort of an agreement being made between Israel and Turkey, and they're going to talk about a pact, a security pact, and they're going to talk about peace and diplomacy and cooperation. But if that happens, it's not going to last long. Eventually, it'll just crumble, right? So if there is a security pact formed between the Israelis and the Turks, eventually it'll just crumble. And eventually there's going to be a clash. The clash between Turkey and Israel is inevitable. And the reason for that is because of the fact that they both have antithetical worldviews. They both have antithetical agendas for the Middle East. Turkey wants to establish its Ottoman Empire, a neo-Ottoman empire, and the Israelis want to establish this whole idea of Greater Israel, and they want to push the Palestinians out. And the Turks want to bring back their empire. And part of their former empire was what is now called Israel. And so the Israelis, they're currently doing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. 40,000 Palestinians have been driven out of their homes currently. It's pretty sad, and the Israeli government said that those Palestinians will not be allowed to go back to their homes. They will not be allowed to return to their homes. They are entire Palestinian neighborhoods that have been literally purged of Palestinians. And you have soldiers going rogue, Israeli soldiers going rogue, and going to individual Palestinian homes and saying, if you don't leave, we're going to kill you. So we are seeing actual ethnic cleansing being conducted, being orchestrated in the West Bank. And the Turks have been talking about this. Turkey has been talking about how Israel's policy against the Gazans, against the Palestinians, has been genocidal, is genocidal. And so the Turks are going to, I believe that the Turks are going to use Israel's policy of ethnic cleansing on the Palestinians to justify a war against Israel. And it will be a pretext for Turkey to justify an invasion of Israel. And they'll say that it's, they're going to say that a war with Israel they're going to say that a war with Israel will be for justice and for the security of the Palestinians. But in reality, it'll be for this idea of bringing glory back to Turkey and reviving the Ottoman Empire. That's what it's going to be about. It really is that simple. I've talked about this many times, but I'm going to keep talking about this. And, you know, as every week passes and as every live stream is done, the world just gets weirder and weirder. The world gets weirder and weirder after every live stream. So we're always going to have material to talk about. I'm always going to have content to do videos on. And I'll be doing videos until either I die or until the internet just completely disappears, because civilization will have been destroyed by then. So we have yet to see. So it says here, Israel has publicly declared its mistrust of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the Islamist faction that led the campaign that toppled Assad and which emerged from a group that was affiliated to Al-Qaeda until it cut ties in 2016. And what they don't mention is the fact that HTS used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra, and that Israel had been funding Jabhat al-Nusra for years. They don't talk about that. So the very organization, the very terrorist organization that Israel says it fears, was the very organization that was receiving Israeli funds. So now Israel is saying, oh, we're really scared of HTS. Israel is not scared of HTS. Israel funded HTS. Israel used HTS as a proxy against Bashar al-Assad. Israel is not worried about HTS. Israel is worried about a very, very organized military force with advanced technology going to war against it. And that advanced military force is Turkey. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Sunday that Israel will not tolerate the presence in southern Syria of HTS or any other forces affiliated with the new rulers, and demanded the territory be demilitarized. So Israel is telling Turkey, you have to demilitarize southern Syria. We are not going to tolerate terrorists being on our borders. We're not going to tolerate that, because Israel does share a border with southern Syria. So the Israelis are saying, we don't want terrorists near our southern border. Kind of like how the Americans talk, we don't want these cartels on our southern border, which is understandable. It's very understandable. So Israel is saying, we don't want terrorists on our southern border. Turkey, you need to take care of this. And so we are seeing really the beginning stages of the clash between Turkey and Israel. And I can imagine one day the Israelis telling the Turks, they are terrorists on our border. You haven't done anything about it. We now have to do some sort of military policy in Syria, and that is going to anger the Turks, and the Turks are going to say, okay, well, we have to go to war. I can totally see this sort of scenario playing out. I can totally see it. And it says here, now Syria is deeply concerned about Turkey's role as a close ally of Syria's new rulers, 3 U.S. sources said, describing the messages delivered by Israeli officials. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan, who leads the Islamist-rooted AK party, said last year that Islamic countries should form an alliance against what he called the growing threat of expansionism from Israel. So Erdogan is saying, let's create a pan-Islamist military force, of course Turkey will lead it, against Israel. So Erdogan, see, I was thinking about this earlier today. Erdogan is like an Otto von Bismarck. That's how I see him. And I didn't think about this until earlier today. He's like a Bismarck. Now, what do I mean by that? Bismarck wanted to do more or less what the Nazis eventually did, but he didn't do it. The worst that he did was he ethnically cleansed Poles out of certain areas of the German Empire. Otto von Bismarck wanted to exterminate the Poles. He pushed tens of thousands of Poles out of their homes. He pushed out a lot of Jews. He got rid of Jewish people from Germany. But he didn't do a genocide. He did ethnic cleansing. But he did say, I want to exterminate the Polish people. And Otto von Bismarck preached a lot of fear. He cultivated this environment of anxiety in Germany by saying that the British are our enemies, the French are our enemies, and he was promoting fear of the British, promoting paranoia about the French. He promoted the idea of genociding the Poles. And then you fast forward to World War I, and you see that fear that Otto von Bismarck was promoting escalating to a full-on war, World War I. And you see those very fears still lingering in Germany when it was under Hitler. And then you had the outbreak of World War II. And the Germans went to war against the British, they went to war against the French, they went to war against the Poles, and they genocided the Poles. And so that Bismarckian nationalism still remained within the ideology of German identitarianism, within the ideology of German nationalism. So Bismarck, while he didn't do exactly what the Nazis did, he didn't do the genocidal policy that the Nazis carried out. What Bismarck did was he created the environment in which Nazism would thrive. He created the environment in which Germany's expansionist policy in World War I would thrive. And I think Erdogan is doing the same thing. I think what Erdogan is doing is he is priming Turkey for war against its neighbors. He is promoting fear of the Israelis. He is promoting this idea of Turkish militarism, and he's also carrying it out. He is really advancing this agenda of Turkish militarism. And so what I think is going to happen is, just as you had these hardcore militarists take over Germany after Bismarck, and these militarists would eventually lead Germany in World War I, and just how later on you had the German militarist lead the Germans in World War II, I think eventually what's going to happen in the future is you're going to have these Turkish militarists filled with the very fervor that Erdogan promoted, carrying out a policy, a mass policy of Turkish expansionism that'll be much more dramatic than what we're seeing now. It'll be a dramatic shift from what Erdogan is currently doing. It'll be much worse than what Erdogan is currently doing, is what I'm trying to say. So just as Bismarck's primed up Germany for World War I and World War II, Turkey, I believe, is priming Turkey for a massive, massive conflict with both the Israelis and the Russians. And then it says here, earlier this month, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said Israel was concerned Turkey was supporting efforts by Iran to rebuild Hezbollah, and that Islamist groups in Syria were creating another front against Israel. Turkey has said it wants Syria to become stable and pose no threat to its neighbors. It has repeatedly said Israel's actions in southern Syria were part of its expansionist and invasive policy and showed Israel did not want regional peace. So Turkey is saying Israel doesn't want peace. That's very obvious due to the fact that Israel invaded Syria right after Bashar al-Assad was toppled. So the Turks are saying, look, this is proof that Israel doesn't want peace. We got to prepare for war with the Israelis. And the Israelis are saying, look at the Turks expanding into Syria. They don't want peace. We have to prepare for war with the Turks. To contain Turkey, Israeli officials have sought to persuade U.S. officials that Russia should keep its Mediterranean naval base in Syria's Tartus province and its Himyman air base in Latakia province, the sources said. you want an Iranian ally instead of Turkey. Isn't it amazing that the Israelis are now asking for another Iranian ally to stay in Syria? Wait, hold on. I thought Israel was an ally of NATO. They're with NATO. They're friends with NATO. They're friends with America. Why doesn't Israel want a fellow NATO ally to be next door? Don't they want a member of NATO as opposed to some crazy Russian ally? No. Or sorry, as opposed to some Iranian ally? Russia is an ally of Iran. You would think, right, that the Israelis would say, okay, we want a NATO ally. Okay, here's a NATO ally, Turkey. No. Sorry. We want another Iranian ally next door. Why? Because apparently the Iranian allies are a lot nicer. They're a lot easier to deal with. It's just crazy. It's like, make up your mind. Do you want NATO or do you want an Iranian ally next door? It says here, when Israeli officials presented Russia's continued presence in a positive light in a meeting with U.S. officials, some attendees were surprised, arguing that Turkey, a NATO member, would be a... Look at this. Look at this, guys. When Israeli officials presented Russia's continued presence in a positive light in a meeting with U.S. officials, some attendees were surprised, arguing that Turkey, a NATO member, would be a better guarantor of Israel's security. Two of the U.S. sources said Israeli officials were adamant that was not the case, the sources said. So the Israelis go to the Americans and they say, listen, we prefer Russia to be next door instead of Turkey because Turkey is one of our enemies. Turkey is a major enemy. It's our biggest enemy. And the Americans tell the Israelis, no, Turkey is a NATO member. Don't you want a NATO member to be next door? Why would you want some Iranian ally, Russia, to be next door? Why would you want that? Don't you want an ally of the United States? No. We don't want that ally. We really don't. It's just so crazy to see this. So it says here, Israeli officials, however, voiced concern to U.S. officials that the new government could pose a serious threat and that Syria's new armed forces might one day attack, the sources said. So the Israelis are saying that the Turks could actually attack us. That Syria's new armed forces. And again, they're not concerned about solely Syria's new armed forces. They're not solely concerned about rebels. Now, if Turkey trains the Syrian terrorists, the HTS members, which they are, if they train them to the point where they become a serious military force, then yeah, Israel would be concerned. But again, just dealing with Syria's military wouldn't be an existential threat. An existential threat would be dealing with a major Turkish power right next door. Assad kept the frontier with the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights quiet. Oh, look at this. Look at this. I thought Assad was evil. Thought he was like the evilest guy ever. He was a monster. Assad kept the frontier with the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights quiet for years, despite his alliance with Israel's arch-foe Iran. So the eye doctor really wasn't that bad. He wasn't that bad. Why did you get rid of him? I thought you guys were supposed to be smart. Two sources said that in the final weeks of U.S. President Joe Biden's term, his administration considered offering sanctions relief to Syria's new leaders in exchange for closing Russia's 2 military bases. The sources said Biden's team failed to secure a deal before Trump took office, of course, on January 20th, and that they expected the new U.S. president, who has drawn closer to Russian President Vladimir Putin, to be more open to Russia. Israel's lobbying to keep Syria weak points to a starkly different approach to other U.S. allied states in the region, notably Saudi Arabia, which said last month it was talking to Washington and Brussels to help lift Western sanctions. A source in Erdogan's AK party said Ankara hosted Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Tuesday in part as a hedge against the uncertainty of the new U.S. policy in Syria and to balance any Israeli measures there, including with the U.S. that threaten Turkish interest. I could totally see Turkey just slaughtering Israel and Russia not doing anything about it in the beginning. And then in the end, Russia going in and stopping it. I can see that happening. Why do I say that? Because during World War II, the Russians saved the Jews. They don't talk about that, but they did. They saved the Jews from the Nazis. And so because history doesn't entirely repeat but rhymes, I could foresee Turkey doing the next Holocaust in Israel, Russia not doing anything about it initially, and then Russia eventually intervening to save the Jews and also to save the Christians who live in Israel and also who live in the West Bank and Gaza. Fingers crossed for Turk-Iran alliance. I think you're going to see it. Yeah, I think eventually Turkey and Iran will ally against Israel because they're going to say, listen, why are we fighting each other? If we fight each other, that'll be exactly what Israel wants. Israel wants us to fight each other because that would keep us weak, and that'll keep Israel away from us as a threat. So why not just double team, join forces, become even more powerful, and we'll be an even more powerful force against Israel.